Johnny Tremaine, Chapter 12, Section 1. A Man Can Stand Up. By insignificant back alleys and little trod lanes, Johnny made his way to the ferry slip in North Boston. From there to Charlestown, boats were going back and forth. The wounded were taken off first. No civilian, except only the Boston doctors who had offered their services, were allowed close to the wharf. It was well Johnny had thought to put on Pumpkin's uniform. Mrs. Bessie had been right about one thing. A Yankee caught impersonating a British soldier would be shot. He kept well out of the moonlight and away from the flare of torches, and huddled between a warehouse and a tanning shed. His uniform said he was a private in the 4th Regiment, the King's Own. Pumpkin had not been big and bold enough for a grenadier, nor clever enough for a light infantryman, just a simple foot soldier. Obviously, a foot soldier of the 4th would have left Boston that morning with Percy, would have mucked about for 12 hours shooting and being shot at. And he would not already be back in Boston unless he had been wounded. The smartness or good-lookingness of the uniform, which at first had delighted him, he now saw was a danger. He lay down and rolled in the muck of the tanning shed, tore his jacket on a nail, and pulled off a button. The black and silver hat he stamped on, banged out of shape, and pulled on well over his eyes. He put mud on his face, pricked his wrist, and smeared his cheek with blood. Then he stepped out on the wharf. Just to clarify, a tanning shed would be where they transfer animal hides to leather. So it would be gross, it'd be stinky, it would have a lot of kind of disgusting stuff in it. This would be a great place for Johnny to really mess up his nice, neat uniform. An officer who'd been in town all day moved up to him. Johnny saluted. "Wounded?" "Not much, sir." "Well, better report to the medical officers. They're using the house as a temporary hospital. Others are worse off than I. I'll wait till the bad ones have been tended to." "That's the spirit. How was the fighting?" "Very heavy, sir." "Can those damned Yankees shoot straight?" Johnny had been around the regulars enough to know that was a question that should be answered by oaths, in spite of Mr. Lapham's training. The officer laughed and moved down the wharf. Although now no townsmen, except only the doctors, were permitted on the wharf, Johnny knew that hundreds of them stood well back and in darkness, gloating, feeling superior, basically. They were not saying much, only watching. Then one man began to whistle, and the next took it up, and the next, and the next. The whistling was as shrill, as high-pitched as a fife, one of those military flutes. They had not forgotten the prophecy of that morning. They go out by Yankee Doodle, but they'll dance to it before nightfall. Yankee Doodle filled the darkness as the eerie shrilling of the hylas fill black swamps in spring. So that's something that you've almost certainly never experienced. A hyla is, I had to look this up, it's a kind of frog, and it makes like a totally creepy sound that's not like ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. It makes a totally creepy, like screaming sound in swamps. So anyway, these Boston locals, likely Whigs, are whistling Yankee Doodle to make the British feel intimidated and to show that they are better than the British. 4 more boats were coming in. Johnny dared move out onto the wharf, but he still kept well in shadow. More wounded. Could these be the very men who had started out so confidently? Bedraggled, dirty, torn uniforms, torn flesh, lost equipment, faces ghastly with fatigue and pain. Some were twisting and crying out. The first 2 boats were filled with privates. They had been packed in, and now were being tossed ashore like so much cordwood. That would be small pieces of wood tied together by a cord. It would be low value. Most of them were pathetically good and patient, but he saw an officer strike a man who was screaming. Johnny's hands clenched. It is just as James Otis said, he thought. We are fighting partly for just that. Because a man is a private is no reason he should be treated like cordwood. The 3rd boat was moving in with a creak of oarlocks, and he heard an exclamation. "Colonel Smith!" There were only 2 wounded on this boat, for both were officers. Getting the fat colonel up and off the bottom of the dory or boat was heavy work. He was rolled upon a stretcher and carried to the hospital. He had been shot through the leg. Johnny had never seen Colonel Smith except when he was rosy with good brandy, pompous with pride in himself and the men he commanded. Now he was tallow-colored, that same melted candle color as Merchant Light was, and as deflated as a pricked bladder. So a bladder would be used in place of a bladder, an animal's bladder, like their actual like urine holding bladder, would have been used as a ball. So to say he's as deflated as a pricked bladder is to say he looks like maybe a football or a soccer ball with all the air let out of it. The other officer crawled off unaided. A torch suddenly lighted his face, a dark, young face, his lips locked to keep down any cry of pain, one arm in a bloody sling. Rab! Oh, Rab! Of course not. It was Lieutenant Stranger. Instinctively, Johnny started forward to help him, for everyone else was so busy with the wounded colonel. Stranger was left to shift for himself. The boy thought in time of his own danger. Of course, if Johnny went to help Lieutenant Stranger, Stranger would immediately know who he was, and Johnny would probably be shot for impersonating a soldier. How curious a thing is war. Yesterday, this man was, in a way, his friend. Lieutenant Stranger walked stiffly and in agony and a lot of pain toward the hospital. And then another boat, more wounded. The sight of them sickened Johnny. Gray and twisted lips, hollow eyes. But I can't leave. I've got to stay about. Watch my chance for a ride over. Next, what was left of Colonel Smith's command began to arrive. They had been marching, and much of the time under fire, for 24 hours. They had gone without food or water. As the men stumbled off the boats, there were plenty of questions and answers. Johnny would not be able to tell Dr. Warren the exact number of casualties the British had suffered, but he could tell him that they thought they were heavy. The very last man of Colonel Smith's command to return was Major Pitcairn. His face still looked cheerful and confident. They had been licked, had they? Licked meaning defeated. All right. The tough old Marine had been licked before. As he stepped ashore, suddenly the soldiers about the ferry slip began to cheer. Let's get back at 'em, Major, they yelled. He grinned and stuck out his jaw. We'll take another try, he said. And if next time we don't clean up on those, he went off into the profanity, the curse words for which he was famous, to describe what he thought of their enemies. And a roar, happy roar, went up from the men. Now Johnny learned that the bulk of Percy's brigade would be left over in Charlestown, camped on Bunker Hill until the next morning. Johnny believed the time had come for him to act. The sailors from one of the boats were standing about arguing whether or not they were supposed to go to the Somerset for the night, or over to Charlestown. Johnny ran up to them. I have a message for Earl Percy. He was breathing hard from excitement, but it might have come from running. Get me over there quick, boys. Oh, you go whistle for your general, said one of them. You go whistle for your mama. We're sailors, not soldiers, see? Just let me take your boat. That's irregular. Well, I've got to get over and I can't swim, can I? You ask Lieutenant Swift. He's in charge of us. The last thing Johnny wanted was to be questioned by an officer. Will you or won't you take me across? Not without orders, you little wabbler. What's up, men? A quiet voice asked. The sailors saluted. This here baby boy says he's got a message for Earl Percy. He wants us to row him over. Then you will do so. Aye, aye, sir. Nobody had asked to see Johnny's letter. Johnny was rowed across and landed at a wharf in Charlestown. Quickly, he slipped up a cobbled street, turned into a garden, stripped off his uniform, and hung it on a clothesline. He found a water pump, and washed his face. Although past midnight lights showed in all but the abandoned houses, and the people of Charlestown were in a panic. They dared not go to bed with over 1,000 British soldiers suddenly camped upon them, defeated soldiers whose mood might turn ugly. These soldiers only wanted to be let alone, allowed to sleep, but the inhabitants thought they might butcher them all. So noticing our point of view shift, right? If you were a local resident, maybe a Whig, and 1,000 soldiers were suddenly hanging around, you'd probably be scared too. But the soldiers, they just want a bed. Johnny glanced in at 2 or 3 taverns. British soldiers were sleeping in chairs, on benches, on the floors, but he remembered that one of the tavern keepers was a prominent son of liberty. There he tiptoed in among the sleeping guests, found a 9-year-old girl servant hidden behind a flour barrel in the pantry, and got her to lead him to the summer house where the tavern keeper and his wife had moved for the night. From the tavern keeper he learned for the first time what had happened after the skirmish, the fight at Lexington. Colonel Smith had indeed marched on to Concord, possessed the town, destroyed such military stores as had not yet been hidden, and there had been another skirmish, you might even call it a battle, at North Bridge. But from everywhere, all about, had come the Minutemen. Obviously, Smith had been a little afraid of leaving the safety of the village. He would wait where he was for the reinforcements he had sent for, even before Lexington. But Percy did not come and did not come. Every moment more and more Minutemen were arriving, surrounding the village. At noon, Smith had decided to try to take his men back. He dared wait no longer. Then the shooting began. The Minutemen, from behind stone walls and barns, trees, bushes, had opened fire. Beaten and bloody, almost in a panic, Colonel Smith's troops struggled through to Lexington. So they went out So originally they had gone from Boston, crossed over to Charlestown, and then if we take a look at the map, we can see that it's, from Boston up to Charlestown, and then followed this line up to Lexington, went out to Concord. At Lexington, they surprised the town, and they killed a handful of men. Remember the 70 against 700 at Lexington. Then they went on to Concord, and they were like, heck yeah, we're going to take Concord. And then all of a sudden, boatloads of Minutemen. And Smith was all like, oh, it's cool. Earl Percy is on his way. He's going to bring all those 1,200 men. We're going to crush these upstarts. But by noon, Smith was in Concord like, maybe we better peace out. And so they started back toward Lexington. But on the way, pew, 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 Minutemen all over the place. So they finally got back to Lexington, and there we continue with the story. Colonel Smith's troops struggled through to Lexington. Not until then did Percy's reserves arrive. If they had not come, every one of Smith's command would have been killed. And from Lexington, the British had drawn back to Menotomy. From there, the wounded Scarlet Dragon had crawled over Charlestown Common, crossed into safety at Charlestown Neck, and were covered by the Somerset's gun. And here they were. They had been badly beaten. So if we take a look at that, they had Percy's troops had finally joined Smith's troops in Lexington, and then they headed back. Medford and Menotomy would be fairly close, so they made it over to here, and then through Charlestown's Neck up until the big Somerset man of war could protect them here in Charlestown. What of Dr. Warren? He had been everywhere, one moment fighting and dressing the wounds, the next. He had fought like a wildcat, but the innkeeper had no idea where he was now. He didn't get hurt? I'm told he had a lock of hair shot away. He came that close to death. Have you by any chance heard how it fared with the men of Lexington? I believe 7 or 8 of them were killed in that first volley. Do you know their names? No, but by the time the British got back to Lexington from Concord, the Lexington men were ready for them, and they fit 'em and harried 'em all the way to Charlestown.